Endgame in chess is the third phase of the game, first and second being the opening and the middle game respectively. It is recommended for players to study the endgame first before the other two. That is because the endgame is theoretical, meaning it has already been solved. If you find yourself in a winning position and you realize that, and you know how to win it, then the victory will more likely be yours. As the title suggests, we are here to go over endgame techniques for beginners. So this would involve the staircase, the box, and others. So I am using Jeremy Silman's endgame book for reference. I hope you enjoy and learn with me, and without further ado, let's get started. The first technique that I'm going to show you is called the staircase. This will involve your heavy pieces, the queen and rook, in any combination. So you can have two queens, two rooks, or a queen and a rook. So the two queens and two rooks is not really a lot trickier, but there's just something that you have to bear in mind when you have either two queens or two rooks. But for now, let's focus on having a queen and a rook against a lone king. So the idea of this technique is to push the enemy king back to these four sides of the board. So we can do that by cutting off a file or a rank from the king using one of your two major pieces and using the other one to check the king and move it back further to the side of the board. So it's called the staircase because you're like going up the stairs when you execute this technique. Later on this video, I will be providing some positions for you to practice on. But first, let's take a look at this position. So here we have the enemy king on c7 and we have a queen and a rook. So if we immediately use one of our two major pieces to check the king, let's say we play rook g7, you can see that the king can move forward and farther away from this side of the board. So this will only prolong the game. So this is not really efficient. So as I mentioned earlier, what we want to do is to cut off the enemy king from a file or rank. So we can do that by playing either queen to f6 or rook to g6. So I'm going to play rook g6 here. So as you can see, we have cut off the enemy king from moving forward. So we have limited the king to move on these squares only. So let's say he plays king to d7, and now we can use our other major piece to check the king, and it will only move it back farther to this rank. So king c8, and we can deliver checkmate on the back rank. So the queen covers this rank, and the rook covers this. Now let's say we have two queens against a lone king. So you are completely winning in this position, but there are two ways in which you can mess this up. It's either you give away your queens, or you allow stalemate. So you just have to keep in mind those things when you're playing with two queens. So we can still apply the idea that we talked about earlier, where we cut off the king and push it to one of these sides of the board. So we're going to push this king to this side again. So let's cut off the enemy king by playing queen to e4. So we're limiting the king's movement again. It can no longer move forward. So let's say he plays king to e5, and let's play king to b5. And we're just gonna run down these two queens here to this side of the board along with the king. King c7, queen b7, and we deliver checkmate on the 8th rank. Now don't get me wrong, but there is an easier way to achieve checkmate, so we can actually achieve checkmate in 3 here in this position, but I'm just showing you the staircase technique because that's what we're doing here. So we can actually play queen d1 here, queen d1, let's say queen c4, queen a to d4, queen b5 only move, and queen 1 to a4. That's checkmate. But you don't have to worry about that we can still achieve checkmate by using staircase. If you get a little better, then you can try to calculate for techniques like that. Now we have two rooks against a lone king. So the things that you have to keep in mind when you're playing with two rooks is that the king can actually threaten one of your rooks. So here if we try to cut off the enemy king from moving here on this file, then let's say you played rook to f2, so the king can just capture that because the rooks cannot defend each other when they are diagonally adjacent. So if this rook was a queen, the queen would have defended that, but that is not the case in this position. So you have to bear in mind that you have to keep the rooks as far away as possible from the king. So that's the only tricky part when you have two rooks against a lone king. Okay, so let's try to cut off the enemy king again by playing rook to f1. You cannot play rook to f2 because it can just capture it. So let's say the king moves to e4. By the way, we're trying to push the enemy king to this side of the board, to the a file. So rook e4, and we can play rook to e2, then rook d3. So as you can see, we cannot play rook to d1 here because the king just captures the rook. So this will just prolong the game. So what we want to do is to move this rook as far away as possible from the king. But we should still keep this rook on this file because if we move it out of the way, then the king can just move to the middle of the board again. So we should keep in mind that we're trying to push this enemy king to this side of the board, to the a file. So let's say we play rook to e7. So we're still preventing the king from moving here. So let's say he plays rook to d2 this time. Now we cannot play rook to d1 because the king covers that. And we cannot play rook to d7 because the king can just move back here. So let's try to move our other rook as far away as possible again. So now the king is still cut off from this file, and the king can only move closer to this side of the board or to these two squares. So let's say he plays king to d3. We can play king to d8 now, rook to d8 now rather. King to c4, rook to c7, king to b5, rook to b8, and king to a6. So we can play rook to a7. Again, the king covers that. So we can try to move this rook as far away as possible. Let's say he plays king to a7, move the other rook as far away as possible, and whatever move the king plays, we can deliver checkmate with our c1 rook, and we play it to rook to a1. Now, just like the other position with the two queens, there is an easier way to achieve checkmate here. We can actually achieve it in 5 moves, but again, I'm just showing you the staircase technique. So you don't really have to worry about that for now because you're still just a beginner. So the staircase maneuver is the easiest way to make use of a lopsided material count, such as two queens versus lone king, queen and rook versus lone king, or two rooks versus lone king. So I will be providing some example problems later, and you try to solve it, and let's move on to the other technique. The next one I'm going to show you is called the box. So the box is a crucial endgame concept, and you will have plenty of opportunities to apply it throughout your chess career. Remember that the box is simply the simplest to understand. It isn't necessarily the fastest way to mate. King and queen versus king, as well as king and rook versus king, are examples of this. So the aim is to lock the enemy monarch in a box that is getting smaller and smaller. It's crucial to note the point about utilizing both the king and queen to curse this match. So chess is a team game where your pieces depend on your whole army to get a job done. Since a lone rook or even a queen can mate the enemy king, you will have to get your king involved if you wish to score the full point. In most endgames, basic and complicated, king participation is a huge part of a successful winning campaign or defensive stand. So in this position, a lone queen cannot mate the enemy king. Unlike the previous cases of two rooks versus king and two queens versus king, white's king must join in the hunt or mate cannot be achieved. So white can't mate without the aid of his king. Thus, he needs to march it over to the queen side immediately. So he can start that by playing king to g2 and then king to f2 or f3 and then king to e4, king to a5 or king to a4, king to e4. So we're just gonna march this king near the enemy king. And you get the concept. So technically we're still limiting the movement of the king by having this queen here. And we can achieve checkmate just like that. Now let's look at another position. So the scenario here is that the, the white player just moved his queen from g6 to e6. So this cuts off these squares from the enemy king. So if we continue this position, let's say he plays king to b5, and then we can play king to d4, king to b4, and then queen to b6. So we can see how quickly the box shrinks. Mate follows king to a3, king to c3, king to a4, and then queen to b4. Now let's take at other positions. Okay, this time we have a king on b2, king on d2, and a rook on c1. So we can see that this enemy king is trapped on the b file and on the a file due to this rook controlling the c file. But if we play rook to c3 here, as you can see, the king has been limited to these squares only, so it can no longer move to, to b3 and a3 because of the rook cutting it off. Now bear in mind that the rook will be undefended if you move your king away. You have to always have your king beside your rook to defend it because a lone rook cannot checkmate a king. So now let's go back to having a queen and king against a king. So as mentioned earlier, white needs to use both of his pieces to checkmate the king because a lone queen cannot checkmate a lone king. So let's take a look. So the queen controls this file and rank, and also this diagonal. But we can focus here first. So as you can see, this is the imaginary box that the queen controls. And we can also include the diagonal. But if we play queen to f3 here, as you can see, let's set up the position. So as you can see, the queen covers this file or these squares and these squares as well. And it still covers this diagonal. But a while ago, the king can move to these squares. But now that the queen is on f3, it can no longer move to e6, e5, and e4, and not even on d4 as well. So we are shrinking the box that the enemy can move to. Of course, queen e3 is not the only way to win. One other way, though there are many, some are faster, but this doesn't concern us since we want to stick with our box theme. So one more way is to play queen to g4. So here is queen to g4, and we're simply preventing the king to move here. When we have our queen at e3, the king can still move here. But by playing queen to g4, we're creating this box from g4 to g8 and g4 to a4. So let's continue the position. Queen to g4. And now let's say the king moves to e5. And we can play king to g2, moving our king closer to our queen so that they can deliver the checkmate together. Now let's say king to d5 and queen to f4. So now the box has shrunk more, so we're now controlling f4 to f8 and f4 to a4. So continuing, we have king to e6, queen to g5, and we're still shrinking the box again. We had it at a4 to f4 and f4 to f8. Now we only have it from g5 to g8 and g5 to a5. So now we can play king to d6. So king to d6. And now we can play queen to f5. And then king to c6. And then queen to e5. So as you can see, we are shrinking the box. So we have it here a while ago, but now we have shrunk it from e8 or e5 to e8. So now we have king d6, queen d5, and then king to c7, and then we play queen to e6, queen d7, then queen d6, king c8, or he can also play king to a7, and now we can play queen to b4. So we're still shrinking it. We're still shrinking the box. And after queen b4, king a8. And now white rushes his king up so it can help deliver mate. So we can play king to f3. So we've used the queen to limit the king's movement and push it to the corner or to the side of the board. Now, since we cannot checkmate the king with our queen only, we need the help of our king. So now we have to rush it. So now we can play king to a7, then king to e4, let's say king to a6, king to d5, king a7, king c6, and let's say anywhere he goes, if he plays king to a6, we can deliver mate on b6. And if he plays king to a8, we can deliver mate on b7. So that's how you use the box in this position. So now let's go back and let's look at a different approach. So we have played king to e3, and now let's say he plays king to c4. So with some calculations, we can try to move our king closer with king to g2. So white's king rushes up so it can help its queen push the enemy monarch to the edge of the board. So he plays king to d5, let's say, and then king to f3, king to c4, and then king to e4. So the box was still here, and now it shrunk from d3 to d8, and from d3 to a3. So the king cannot move here. So now king to b4, then king to d5. So we're just depriving the king of squares. So now it can only move here. So let's say the king moves to b5. So the end comes even faster after king to a4 with the moves king to c5 and queen to a3 checkmate. I'm sorry, it was queen to c5, king to c5, because the only move for the king is still a5 and we can deliver mate on a3. So the king needs to move, the king needs to move to b5. And now we can play queen to b3 check, and this pushes the king to a5 or a6. So let's say he plays queen to a6, and we can see the box has shrunk even further. And let's play king to c6, and we're threatening mate in 1. So the king plays to a5, and queen to b5 is checkmate. Or if it plays a7, into b7 is checkmate. So basically, it's easier if you have the queen, but it gets harder if you have a rook. So this is the position we're going for when we have a rook and a king. So as you can see, this position is already checkmate. So the rook is checking the king, and this white king is preventing the black king from moving forward. So the idea here is to drive the enemy king to the edge of the board, just like the other one. But this time, you will need your king more often to drive the king to the edge of the board, because you will need to defend the rook, and the rook only controls some amount of squares, unlike the queen. The queen can also prevent the king from moving to this diagonal. So now let's take a look at this position. So the black is trapped on the back rank because the rook here is limiting the king from moving to the 7th rank, so it can only move sideways. So now we can play king to d6 because we need the help of our king so that we can checkmate the king. So king to d6 is the way to go. And now let's say he plays king to e8, and then we play rook to b7. So the only way to continue here, I'm sorry, rook to b7. So the only way to continue here, to prolong the game, is to go to f8, because if the enemy king goes to e8, then checkmate is inevitable. So king to f8, king to e6, and king to g8, running away as far as possible. King to f6. Now the king cannot go back here because same concept. The rook covers this rank, and the king cannot move forward due to this white king preventing it. So let's move back. So the only way to continue is king to h8, and now we can play king to g6, and the only move is king to g8. And as you can see, the king controls these squares, and now we can deliver checkmate on b8. So we are finally ready to see how to get black's king to the side of the board. It cannot be mated on the middle, so chasing it to any edge, so we can choose these sides of the board, just like on the staircase. So we can choose an edge, and chasing it to any edge is absolutely essential. Now let's take a look at another position. So we can have our first box by moving our rook to g3. So now we have a box from g3 to g8 and from g3 to a3. So let's say the king moves to f4, attacking our rook. Now it is imperative to use our king in this endgame. Both of our pieces must work together if we wish to succeed in pushing the black king to one of the edges of the board. So we need to defend our rook. So we can do that by playing king to g2. So let's say king to e4 happens, and now we can play rook to f3 to further tighten the box. So king to d4, and we need to be careful here. So we cannot just tighten the box with rook to e3 immediately. Why? As you can see, and as obvious as it is, the king can just capture the rook. So we need to set this up first. So we need to play rook to f2, controlling the e3 square. So let's say he plays into e4. While we can play the move e3 now, rook to e3 now, we cannot do that first because the king will just move here. So we're we're just putting complications on our theme. Although this is a good move too, but we need to move our king to e2 first. So now the king is limited from moving here. So it can only move to e5 to c5 and d4. Now let's say the king moves to d4, and now we can tighten the box with rook to e3. So we have our box here from e3 to e8 and e3 to a3. So you would be getting a feel for the method by now. Shrink the box with the rook, move the king, shrink the box with the rook, move the king, repeat until checkmate occurs. So one thing you have to remember, white is not in any hurry. Just follow the prescribed process and the game will literally win itself. In general, you want to keep your rook as far away from the enemy king as possible. One of the few exceptions is when you're creating boxes, in an effort to push the enemy king back to one of the board's corners or sides. So you just need to use your king to defend your rook so that you can create boxes like these. So let's continue. King to c4, rook to d3, since the king controls the d3 square, so we can still play that. Let's say king to b4. Now we need to move our king closer. King to e3, king to c4, and then king to e4. So we just use triangulation there. So that's another endgame concept, but we're not going to tackle that right now. But we can also go king to e4 right here. So as before, there are many ways to win. So don't screech that computer announces a faster mate that would be faster has absolutely no meaning in the present context. But putting the white king in the enemy's face is always a good idea in this particular endgame. So let's continue. King to c5, rook to d4, king to b5, or wait, I said rook to d4, and then king to b5, and then king to d5, putting our king in the enemy's king's face. And then, as you can see, the king is now prevented from moving here, so it can no longer go to these squares. So after king to d5, king to b6 can be played, and then rook to b4 check. So as you can see, it can move here to these squares only, except that. So now the king can move to c7, and black doesn't want to play king to a5. Why? Because it will only trap his king on the edge, and something that is trying to desperately avoid. So we can just play king to c5 here, and checkmate is in 4 moves. So he doesn't want that. Instead, he plays king to c7 and rook to b2. So this is a quiet move that forces the black to move to the back. So this move just wants the enemy king to move to the back rank or step in front of the white king right here. So naturally, rook to b5 and rook to b3 or b1 all have the same effect. So let's say he plays king to d7, going in front of the king. Now, imagine that this is the back rank. So if we check the enemy king right here, you can see that it can no longer move forward because because our king rather is controlling these squares, so it can only move backwards. So king to d8, we can play king to d6, threatening mate, and the enemy king can go to e8, and if you can see, this is familiar to you. We had this in the previous example, so we can play rook to d7 here, cutting off the king from here, and forcing it to move to this corner right here. And now we can play king e6, king g8, we can play king to f6, because if he goes here right now, that move is on the way. So he needs to move to the corner, and king to g6, and we've had this before, and rook to d8 is checkmate. So that's it. You know the winning ideas for all overkill endgames. So I hope you enjoyed our lesson on the staircase and the box. So that is all I can offer you in this endgame tutorial for unrated to 999 ELO players. So I will be giving you some practice problems to work on, and you try to solve it, and the answers will be in the description below. Thank you for watching, and let's move on to the practice problems.